Auschwitz-Birkenau. The name itself has become synonymous with the Holocaust, with industrial murder, with humanity's capacity for absolute evil. Most people know the statistics. Over 1.1 million people murdered. Gas chambers, crematoriums, Dr. Mengelé's experiments, the selection ramp where a pointed finger determined life or death. But there's another Auschwitz that fewer people understand. The Auschwitz, where prisoners didn't die in gas chambers but lived, if you can call it living, for weeks, months, sometimes years. The daily existence of those who were selected for labor rather than immediate death. This isn't the story of liberation or resistance, though both occurred. This isn't primarily about the gas chambers, though they cast their shadow over everything. This is about what it meant to wake up each morning in Auschwitz. What it meant to eat, work, sleep, survive another day in a place designed to destroy human beings. Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish chemist who survived Auschwitz, wrote, "Imagine now a man who is deprived of everyone he loves, and at the same time of his house, his habits, his clothes, in short, of everything he possesses. He will be a hollow man, reduced to suffering and needs, forgetful of dignity and restraint." That was the daily reality of Auschwitz for those who weren't immediately murdered. A systematic process of dehumanization that began the moment prisoners arrived and continued every hour of every day until death or liberation. This is that story. The horrifying daily life of Auschwitz prisoners you never knew about. The journey to Auschwitz typically began in cattle cars. Jews from across occupied Europe, Poland, Hungary, France, Holland, Greece, Italy, were packed into freight trains with no food, no water, no sanitation. The journey lasted days, sometimes over a week. People died standing up because there was no room to fall. Children suffocated in the crush. The elderly collapsed from dehydration. By the time the trains reached Auschwitz, some cars contained only corpses. When the train doors finally opened, prisoners faced total sensory assault. SS guards screaming orders in German, dogs barking, bright lights. The smell, a smell survivors would describe as unforgettable and indescribable, a mixture of burning flesh, excrement, and death. Families were immediately separated, men to one side, women and children to the other. This was often the last time husbands saw wives, parents saw children. No goodbyes were permitted. Guards beat anyone who hesitated. Then came the selection. An SS doctor, often Josef Mengele, sometimes others, would briefly examine each prisoner. A glance, sometimes a question about age or occupation, then a gesture, right or left. Left meant the gas chambers, usually within hours. Right meant admission to the camp as a laborer. Roughly 75–80% of each transport went left. The elderly, the sick, children under 14, mothers with small children, anyone who looked unable to work, all went to immediate death. Those selected for labor didn't yet understand what had happened to the others. The SS maintained an elaborate deception. Guards told new arrivals that families were being sent to different sections of the camp, that they would reunite later, that the separation was temporary. The deception continued. Signs pointed to baths and disinfection. Prisoners selected for death were told to remember where they hung their clothes so they could retrieve them after showering. Some were given towels and soap. The charade continued until the gas chamber doors sealed shut. Meanwhile, those selected for labor underwent a process designed to strip away their identity and humanity. First came confiscation of belongings. Prisoners were ordered to leave all possessions, suitcases, bags, valuables, on the platform. They were told these would be returned later. This was a lie. Everything was stolen, sorted by prisoners in a section called Canada, and either used by the SS or sent to Germany. The value of stolen property was immense. Gold, jewelry, currency, clothing, even haircut from corpses. All had economic value to the Nazi state. Auschwitz functioned not just as a murder factory, but as a vast theft operation. Next came the bathhouse, a real one this time, not a gas chamber. Prisoners were stripped naked, their heads completely shaved, hair from scalp, body, everywhere. This served practical purposes, lice control, but also psychological ones. Nakedness and baldness stripped away dignity and individuality. Men and women who had been modest in their previous lives were now exposed before strangers and guards. The humiliation was deliberate. Breaking down psychological resistance began immediately. After the shaving came tattooing. Auschwitz was the only Nazi camp that tattooed prisoners with identification numbers. The number was usually tattooed on the left forearm. From this moment, prisoners ceased to have names in the camp bureaucracy. They were numbers. Primo Levi's number was 174517. He wrote, "My name is 174517. We have been baptized. We will carry the tattoo on our left arm until we die." Then came prison uniforms, not individual clothing, but whatever ill-fitting striped uniform was available. No undergarments, wooden clogs that didn't fit, causing blisters and injuries. In winter, this clothing was wholly inadequate. In summer, it bred disease. The entire arrival process, from train to admission to camp, took hours. By the end, prisoners were exhausted, confused, traumatized, and transformed. They had been stripped of possessions, clothing, hair, names, and dignity. They had been reduced to numbers wearing rags. Only then did they enter the main camp. Auschwitz consisted of multiple sections. Auschwitz-WWII was the original camp. Auschwitz-II-Birkenau was the massive expansion where most murders occurred. Auschwitz-III-Monowitz was a labor camp for the IG Farben chemical plant. There were also numerous subcamps. Prisoners lived in barracks, long wooden or brick buildings originally designed as horse stables. Each barrack was intended to house 52 horses. The SS packed in 400 to 500 prisoners. In Birkenau, many barracks were wooden structures with no insulation, no heating, inadequate ventilation. In summer, they were sweltering. In winter, they were freezing. Temperatures inside barely differed from outside. The sleeping arrangements were designed for maximum misery. Prisoners slept in 3-tiered wooden bunks with no mattresses, just wooden boards. Multiple prisoners shared each bunk, sometimes 5 to 8 people in a space meant for 2. There were no blankets initially, and when they were provided, they were thin and infested with lice. Prisoners slept pressed against each other for warmth, but this also spread disease. The barracks had no bathrooms. Instead, there was a bucket that served as a toilet for hundreds of people. By morning, it overflowed. The smell was overwhelming. Each barrack had a Blockälteste, a prisoner appointed as block elder, and Stubendienst, room orderlies. These prisoner functionaries had power over other prisoners and could be brutal or relatively humane depending on the individual. Many Blockälteste were criminals, non-Jewish prisoners imprisoned for actual crimes, who the SS deliberately placed in authority over Jewish prisoners. These criminals often treated Jewish prisoners with savage cruelty. But some prisoner functionaries tried to help others when possible. They might warn about upcoming selections, sneak extra food to starving prisoners, or protect weaker inmates from the worst abuses. These small acts of humanity occurred within a system designed to eliminate humanity. Life in the barracks followed rigid rules. Prisoners had assigned places. Moving without permission brought punishment. Talking after lights out brought punishment. Everything brought punishment. Morning began around 4 a.m. with a gong or whistle. Prisoners had minutes to relieve themselves using the overflowing bucket, or the communal latrine outside, then rush to roll call. Roll call, Appell in German, was one of Auschwitz's daily torments. Prisoners lined up in rows outside the barracks in all weather conditions. Guards counted and recounted. The process took hours. During roll call, prisoners stood at attention regardless of weather. In summer sun, people collapsed from heat stroke. In winter, cold, they froze. If anyone moved, fainted, or broke formation, guards beat them. If the count was wrong, everyone stood longer while guards recounted. Roll call served multiple purposes. It verified all prisoners were accounted for, discouraged escape attempts, and functioned as mass punishment and intimidation. Prisoners died during roll call from exposure, beatings, or being shot for minor infractions. After morning roll call came breakfast, a term that mockingly described what prisoners received. The meal consisted of a brown liquid called coffee, though it contained no actual coffee. It was hot water with some kind of grain or acorn substitute. It provided minimal calories and no nutrition. The barracks themselves bred disease. Lice infested every surface, spreading typhus. Rats scavenged constantly. Bed bugs attacked sleeping prisoners. Dysentery was epidemic due to poor sanitation and contaminated water. Tuberculosis spread rapidly in the cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. Scabies infected skin. Fungal infections were universal. With no medical treatment available to most prisoners, these conditions became chronic. The barracks were also where prisoners experienced their most private moments of despair. At night, women whispered about their murdered children. Men wept silently for lost families. People prayed, or abandoned faith, or simply stared at darkness, wondering if they would survive another day. Relationships formed in the barracks despite everything. Friendships developed. People shared information, food scraps, emotional support. Some prisoners organized themselves into small groups, often from the same hometown or family, who looked after each other. These bonds were survival mechanisms. Primo Levi wrote about his friend Alberto, how their friendship helped both survive. Viktor Frankl wrote about how maintaining human connections gave prisoners reason to endure. But the barracks were also sites of betrayal. Some prisoners informed on others to gain favor with guards. Theft was common. Desperate people stole from each other. Violence between prisoners occurred, though less frequently than violence from guards. The Nazi starvation of Auschwitz prisoners was methodical and calculated. The daily rations were scientifically designed to kill prisoners slowly while extracting maximum labor. The morning coffee provided perhaps 50 calories. The midday soup, the main meal, provided 200 to 300 calories. The evening bread ration was typically 300 grams, about 10 ounces, with a small amount of margarine, occasionally a tiny piece of sausage or cheese. Total daily calories, approximately 700, 300. A person doing hard physical labor needs 3,000, 4,000 calories daily just to maintain weight. Auschwitz prisoners received 1/4 to 1/3 of that while performing exhausting labor. The math was simple. Prisoners would slowly starve to death. The soup deserved its own category of horror. It was made from rotted vegetables, potato peels, and occasionally some kind of meat, horse, dog, or something unidentifiable. The soup was thin, watery, and provided minimal nutrition. Prisoners quickly learned that the thickness of the soup varied by when you received it. The bottom of the pot contained more solid material, potato chunks, thicker broth. The top was just colored water. Position in the soup line determined how much actual food you received. This created desperate strategies. Some prisoners tried to position themselves to receive soup from the bottom. Others deliberately arrived late, hoping for thicker portions. The soup distribution became a daily struggle, where luck and strategy determined whether you got 200 or 300 calories. The bread ration was slightly more substantial. German military bread, sometimes sawdust, was mixed in to bulk it up. The bread was often moldy. Prisoners ate it anyway. Mold was calories. The small addition, margarine, sausage, cheese, varied. These items came irregularly. When they came, they provided a small boost of fat and protein. Prisoners hoarded these items, trading them for favors, or saving them for days when no addition came. Hunger dominated every thought. Survivors universally describe the constant, gnawing, overwhelming hunger that never ceased. It wasn't normal hunger that food could satisfy. It was starvation hunger that consumed consciousness. Primo Levi wrote, "Just as our hunger is not that feeling of missing a meal, so our way of being cold has need of a new word. We say hunger. We say tiredness, fear, pain. We say winter. And they are different things. They are free words, created and used by free men who lived in comfort and suffering in their homes. If the lagers had lasted longer, a new, harsh language would have been born. The hunger caused physical transformation. Within weeks, prisoners lost dramatic amounts of weight. Muscle atrophied. Bodies consumed themselves. Faces became skeletal. Eyes sank into heads. Skin stretched tight over bones. This condition was called Muselmann in camp slang, a term of unclear origin that designated prisoners who had reached the final stage of starvation. Muselmänner moved slowly, responded slowly, existed in a haze between life and death. Most died within days or weeks. The hunger also caused mental effects. Prisoners became obsessed with food. They talked constantly about meals they had eaten before Auschwitz, recipes, restaurant meals. They fantasized about food with sexual intensity. Some prisoners made elaborate plans for meals they would eat after liberation. These fantasies provided psychological escape, but also torture, imagining abundance while experiencing starvation. The hunger drove people to desperate measures. Prisoners ate grass, tree bark, anything remotely digestible. They scavenged garbage for scraps. They risked death stealing potato peels from pig feed. The camp's unofficial economy revolved around food. Prisoners traded anything for extra food: clothes, shoes, whatever they could acquire. Those with access to more food, prisoner functionaries, workers in certain positions, had power over the starving. Some prisoners prostituted themselves for food. Women and men both engaged in sexual acts with guards, capos, or other prisoners in exchange for bread or soup. Survival required abandoning previous moral frameworks. The SS deliberately created this desperate economy. By providing inadequate food, they ensured prisoners would focus on individual survival rather than collective resistance. Starving people don't organize rebellions. They search for scraps. There were exceptions to the general starvation. Certain work assignments provided access to more food. Prisoners working in Canada, where belongings were sorted, could steal food from new arrivals' luggage. Kitchen workers could steal scraps. Workers at outside labor sites sometimes obtained food from civilian workers. These positions were highly coveted. Getting assigned to a job with food access could mean the difference between death and survival. Prisoners schemed, bribed, and begged for these positions. Family packages represented another food source, though few prisoners received them. The International Red Cross regulations theoretically allowed families to send packages to prisoners. In practice, most packages never reached intended recipients. SS guards stole the contents, but some packages got through, especially to non-Jewish political prisoners who had connections outside. These prisoners suddenly had chocolate, canned meat, real bread. They became wealthy in camp terms and could trade these items for favors and protection. The food situation created moral dilemmas. Should you share your meager rations with a dying friend, knowing it wouldn't save them and would weaken you? Should you steal from a dying prisoner's bread ration, since they wouldn't survive anyway? Should you trade your shoes for food, knowing you'd need those shoes, but might starve without the food? These weren't theoretical questions. They were daily decisions that determined who lived and who died. The motto over Auschwitz's main gate read, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. This was perhaps the camp's cruelest lie. Work didn't free anyone, it killed them. After morning roll call and breakfast, prisoners marched to work assignments. The SS organized prisoners into work details called commandos, each assigned to different tasks. Some commandos worked inside the camp, cleaning, construction, maintenance. Others marched outside to labor sites, factories, coal mines, agricultural areas. The march itself was ordeal, often several kilometers in wooden clogs that destroyed feet. The work was deliberately exhausting and pointless. Prisoners dug ditches, then filled them in. They moved rocks from one pile to another, then back again. They carried heavy loads up and down stairs for no reason. The point wasn't productivity, it was torture and death through exhaustion. Some work served actual purposes. Auschwitz, 3rd, Monowitz, prisoners worked at the Buna factory, producing synthetic rubber for IG Farben. This was real industrial labor, with real production goals. But the working conditions were designed to work prisoners to death and replace them. IG Farben paid the SS for prisoner labor, a few Reichsmarks per prisoner per day. The company profited from slave labor, while prisoners died building their facilities. After the war, IG Farben executives were prosecuted at Nuremberg, though many received light sentences. Construction commandos built Birkenau's expansion, the very facilities used to murder Jews. Prisoners built the barracks where they would sleep, the gas chambers where their families died, the crematoria that would burn their bodies. The psychological horror of this cannot be overstated. The Sonderkommando represented the most nightmarish work assignment. These prisoners worked in the gas chambers and crematoria. They guided victims into the gas chambers, removed bodies afterward, extracted gold teeth from corpses, and burned bodies in the crematoria. Sonderkommando members received better food and living conditions, but they were regularly murdered and replaced to eliminate witnesses. Most Sonderkommando members died every few months, replaced by new prisoners who would eventually be killed in turn. The psychological toll on Sonderkommando members was unimaginable. They handled the bodies of people from their own transports, sometimes their own relatives. They worked surrounded by death and participated in the murder machinery while knowing they too would be killed. Some Sonderkommando members documented what they witnessed, burying testimony in the ground for future discovery. Several of these documents were found after liberation. Philipp Müller, one of the few Sonderkommando survivors, later wrote a devastating memoir of his experiences. Agricultural commandos worked in fields outside the camp. This work was exhausting, but sometimes provided opportunities to steal vegetables: a carrot, a beet, a potato. Getting caught meant death, but the food was worth the risk for some desperate prisoners. Quarry work was among the deadliest assignments. Prisoners broke rocks in stone quarries, carrying heavy loads, working in all weather. The work destroyed bodies rapidly. Guards shot prisoners who moved too slowly or couldn't keep up. The pace of work was brutal. Kapos, prisoner supervisors, drove workers constantly. Faster! Faster! Beatings accompanied every perceived slowness. The kapos themselves faced pressure from SS supervisors to maintain productivity. Some kapos were sadistically cruel, beating prisoners excessively, killing through abuse. Others showed restraint when SS guards weren't watching, allowing brief rest periods, warning prisoners of incoming inspections. The work environment itself killed. No safety equipment existed. Prisoners worked in freezing cold with inadequate clothing. In summer heat, they received insufficient water. Accidents were common. Falling stones, machinery injuries, construction accidents. Injured prisoners received no medical care and usually died. The workday lasted 12 hours or more. After work came the evening march back to camp, another roll call, then the evening meal, the bread ration. Finally, prisoners could return to barracks, but even then, there was no rest. Evening time in camp included additional duties. Barracks had to be cleaned. Prisoners had to wash their one set of clothing in cold water without soap. They had to deal with lice, with wounds, with sickness, all without proper facilities or supplies. And always, there was the threat of selection. The SS periodically conducted selections in the barracks or during roll call. A doctor would examine prisoners briefly. Those deemed too weak or sick for continued labor were sent to the gas chambers. This meant prisoners had to hide illness and weakness. They forced themselves to stand straight during selections, pinched their cheeks for color, tried to appear healthier than they were. Being selected for the gas chamber wasn't a punishment for any action. It was simply an economic calculation. Non-productive prisoners were waste. Auschwitz was a disease factory. The conditions, malnutrition, overcrowding, poor sanitation, contaminated water, inadequate clothing, created perfect conditions for epidemic disease. Typhus swept through the camp repeatedly. The disease, spread by lice, caused high fever, rash, and delirium. Without treatment, typhus killed approximately 20 to 30% of victims. In Auschwitz, with universal malnutrition and no medicine, the death rate was much higher. Every prisoner had lice. The insects infested clothing, bedding, hair, and bodies. They bit constantly, causing intense itching and spreading disease. Prisoners tried to delouse themselves and their clothes, but with no soap, hot water, or proper facilities, this was impossible. Dysentery was equally devastating. The contaminated water and poor sanitation meant intestinal disease was universal. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death. The communal latrines were sites of constant misery where sick prisoners spent hours. The latrines themselves were nightmarish. Long rows of holes over a pit, no privacy, no toilet paper, no water for washing. Prisoners with dysentery used the latrine constantly, sometimes losing control before reaching it. This caused additional humiliation and spread disease further. Tuberculosis thrived in the crowded barracks. The disease spread through coughing and close contact. Malnourished prisoners had no immune resistance. TB caused prolonged, painful death, coughing blood, wasting away, suffocating as lungs filled with fluid. Skin diseases were universal. Scabies caused intense itching and open sores. Fungal infections spread in the damp, dirty conditions. Frostbite in winter caused wounds that became infected. With no way to keep clean and no medical treatment, these infections became chronic. The camp hospital, called the Revier or Krankenbau, existed, but was itself a death trap. Going to the hospital was dangerous because the SS conducted frequent selections there, sending sick prisoners to the gas chambers. Hospital facilities were grossly inadequate. Few medicines, few instruments, minimal supplies. Prisoner doctors did what they could, but often this was nothing. They could diagnose disease, but rarely treat it. Some prisoner doctors were heroes. They falsified records to hide sick prisoners from selections. They shared their own food rations with patients. They provided psychological support when medical treatment was impossible. Dr. Gisela Pearl, a gynecologist, later wrote about her efforts to save women in the camp. but the hospital also housed Nazi medical experiments. Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted horrific experiments, particularly on twins, dwarfs, and people with unusual physical characteristics. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, injected chemicals into eyes trying to change color, amputated limbs, infected prisoners with disease. Other SS doctors conducted equally horrific experiments. Dr. Karl Klauberg performed sterilization experiments on women. Dr. Horst Schumann exposed prisoners to massive radiation doses to study sterilization methods. These experiments caused excruciating pain and usually killed the subjects. The experiments had no legitimate scientific value. They were torture disguised as research. After the war, some of these doctors were prosecuted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. Mengele escaped to South America and was never brought to justice. Beyond deliberate experiments, the general medical situation was catastrophic. Open wounds became gangrenous. Broken bones went unset. Dental problems caused agonizing pain with no treatment. Women dealt with menstruation without sanitary supplies in filthy conditions. Many women stopped menstruating entirely due to starvation and stress. This was actually fortunate given the conditions. Menstruating women had no way to manage their periods hygienically and faced additional humiliation and discomfort. Pregnant women faced immediate death sentences. The SS policy was that pregnant women were immediately sent to gas chambers. If pregnancy was discovered after arrival, the woman was killed. Some prisoner doctors performed secret abortions to save women's lives, though this meant killing the fetus. Childbirth in Auschwitz was rare and usually fatal. Babies born in the camp were typically killed immediately. A few births occurred in hiding, with prisoner doctors and nurses protecting the mother and infant. Almost none of these babies survived. The elderly and children died rapidly in camp conditions. Their bodies couldn't withstand the starvation, disease, and labor. Most elderly prisoners who weren't immediately gassed died within weeks. Children who avoided the gas chambers rarely survived more than a few months. Mental illness emerged from the constant trauma. Prisoners developed what we now recognize as severe PTSD, depression, and psychosis. Some became catatonic. Others experienced delusions or hallucinations. There was no psychiatric treatment, and mentally ill prisoners were usually sent to gas chambers. Suicide was both common and difficult. Some prisoners threw themselves on the electrified fence. Others deliberately provoked guards into shooting them. Some simply stopped eating and drinking, choosing death over continued suffering. The SS called this going to the wire, when prisoners ran at the electrified fence to kill themselves. Guards sometimes bet on which prisoners would attempt suicide. The fence offered the quickest death available, though it wasn't always instant, and sometimes left prisoners dying slowly. Electrocuted, but not yet dead. Understanding daily life in Auschwitz requires understanding the perpetrators, the SS guards who ran the camp, and the prisoner functionaries who assisted them. The SS at Auschwitz numbered several thousand. They ranged from high-ranking officers who designed the murder system to ordinary guards who implemented it daily. All were complicit. All bore responsibility. Rudolf Höss served as Auschwitz commandant from 1940 to 1943, and briefly again in 1944. He oversaw the camp's transformation into an industrial murder facility. After the war, he was captured, tried, and executed. His autobiography, written in prison, provides chilling insight into the bureaucratic mindset that enabled genocide. Höss wrote about organizing mass murder with the same tone someone might use describing factory logistics. He discussed efficiency problems with the gas chambers, the most effective Zyklon B dosage, how to speed up the cremation process. He viewed mass murder as an administrative challenge. The SS guards varied in their individual cruelty. Some were sadistically brutal, beating and killing prisoners for entertainment. Others performed their duties with bureaucratic indifference, not enjoying the cruelty, but not bothered by it either. A few showed occasional small mercies, but these variations mattered little to prisoners. Even the least cruel SS guard participated in a system designed to torture and kill. Even guards who didn't personally beat prisoners enabled and benefited from the camp's existence. Female SS guards supervised women's camps. These included Irma Greza, Maria Mandel, and others who became notorious for their brutality. They beat prisoners, conducted selections, oversaw executions. After the war, several were prosecuted and executed. The stereotype that female guards were universally more cruel than men isn't supported by evidence. Both male and female guards committed horrific acts. Gender didn't determine cruelty. The system did. The SS lived in comfortable quarters near the camp. They had adequate food, heating, proper clothing. They worked shifts, then returned to normal lives. Some had families living with them. They attended social events, celebrated holidays, maintained the appearance of normalcy. This juxtaposition, torturing prisoners by day, then going home to dinner with family, reveals the psychological compartmentalization that enabled the Holocaust. These weren't aberrant monsters. They were ordinary people who chose to commit or enable atrocities within a system that legitimized those actions. The prisoner functionary system was crucial to camp operations. The SS used prisoners to supervise other prisoners, creating a hierarchical structure that divided prisoners and reduced the number of SS guards needed. Kapos were prisoner supervisors of work details. They reported to SS overseers, but had direct authority over workers. They could beat, punish, and sometimes kill prisoners under their authority. Some kapos were political prisoners, communists, social democrats, resistance members, imprisoned for opposition to Nazism. Some were criminals. Some were Jews who had been in the camp longer and been selected for these roles. Kapo behavior varied enormously. Some were as brutal as SS guards, beating prisoners savagely, killing through abuse. These kapos saw their position as an opportunity for power and sadism. They collaborated fully with the murder system to preserve their own privileged position. Other kapos tried to protect prisoners when possible. They warned of selections, allowed rest breaks when guards weren't watching, shared extra food, and helped prisoners avoid the worst punishments. These kapos risked their own positions and lives to help others. The moral complexity of the prisoner functionary system cannot be overstated. These were prisoners themselves, victims of the Nazi system, who accepted positions of power over fellow prisoners to survive. Some became victimizers. Others remained helpers within impossible constraints. Prisoners debated among themselves whether taking kipo positions was collaboration or survival strategy. After liberation, some former kapos were accused of collaboration or war crimes. Others were recognized as having helped save lives. The Sonderkommando occupied the most morally complex position. They participated directly in the murder process, guiding victims to gas chambers, removing and cremating bodies. Yet they were prisoners themselves, forced into this role under threat of death. Were they collaborators? Victims? Both? These questions troubled Sonderkommando survivors for the rest of their lives. Several wrote testimony describing their internal torment, their guilt, their belief that they would never escape moral judgment, even if they physically escaped. The SS deliberately created these moral quandaries. By forcing prisoners to participate in the murder system, they distributed guilt, divided prisoners, and made resistance more difficult. It's a final cruelty, forcing victims to become accomplices. In a place designed to kill everyone, survival required more than luck. It required strategy, adaptation, and often compromises that haunted survivors forever. Physical survival started with obtaining more food. Prisoners schemed constantly for extra calories. Those with skills valuable to the SS, doctors, electricians, mechanics, musicians, sometimes received better positions with more food. Speaking German was a significant advantage. Prisoners who understood orders quickly avoided beatings. Those who could communicate with guards sometimes negotiated better treatment. Polish Jews generally fared better than Hungarian or Greek Jews, who arrived in 1944 speaking no German or Polish. Maintaining cleanliness was crucial. Prisoners who kept themselves as clean as possible, despite the nearly impossible conditions, had better chances of avoiding disease. Washing daily in cold water without soap, keeping clothes as clean as possible, treating wounds immediately. These practices improved survival odds. Shoes were critical. Wooden clogs destroyed feet, causing infections and making work impossible. Prisoners who obtained better shoes, stolen, traded, or found, preserved their feet and their ability to work. Destroyed feet meant selection for gas chambers. Forming small support groups saved lives. Prisoners from the same town, family members who arrived together, or friends made in the camp, pooled resources and looked after each other. They shared food scraps, warned each other of dangers, nursed each other through illness. Primo Levi credited his friendship with Alberto with helping him survive. Viktor Frankl wrote about how maintaining human connections provided meaning and motivation to endure. Elia Wiesel survived partly because he remained with his father through much of his imprisonment. But survival strategies also involved moral compromises. Stealing from other prisoners, someone's bread ration, their better shoes, their hidden food, was common. The starving stole from the starving. Was this wrong? Was it just survival? Some prisoners informed on others to gain favor with guards. They reported infractions, escape plans, hidden food. This betrayal bought temporary safety for the informer, while dooming others. Sexual survival strategies were complex and troubling. Some women became mistresses to kapos, or SS guards, in exchange for protection and food. Some men engaged in similar arrangements. These relationships were coerced by the fundamental power imbalance and the desperation of starvation. Were these rape, prostitution, survival tactics? The question is perhaps unanswerable. The system created situations where meaningful consent was impossible. People made choices under duress that no one should ever face. Religion helped some prisoners survive psychologically. Maintaining faith provided meaning and hope. Secret prayer services occurred in barracks. Jewish holidays were observed covertly. Some prisoners found strength in belief that their suffering had divine purpose. Others abandoned faith entirely. The question, "Where is God in Auschwitz?" tormented believers. Some concluded God didn't exist or had abandoned them. Elie Wiesel wrote powerfully about his loss of faith, though he later partially reconciled with religious belief. Intellectual and cultural activities provided psychological survival mechanisms. Prisoners secretly shared poetry, stories, music. They held discussions about philosophy, literature, science, anything to maintain mental engagement beyond daily suffering. Orchestra prisoners had unusual positions. The SS maintained orchestras that played as prisoners, marched to work, and during selections. Orchestra members received better rations and avoided the hardest labor. But they played music while people walked to death. Musicians faced profound moral questions. By playing for the SS, were they collaborating? Or were they surviving through their skills, while also providing fellow prisoners brief moments of beauty? Fania Fenelon, who played in the women's orchestra, wrote extensively about these dilemmas. Planning for after liberation helped some prisoners endure. They made detailed plans for reuniting with family, rebuilding lives, bearing witness to what happened. These future-focused thoughts provided motivation to survive another day, but others found such planning painful. Many prisoners correctly understood they would never see their families again. Hoping for reunion meant confronting the reality that loved ones were already dead. Some prisoners survived through emotional numbness. They shut down feeling, became automatons who obeyed orders and performed labor without thinking or feeling. This psychological dissociation protected them from complete mental breakdown. Primo Levi called this becoming a Musulman in spirit, maintaining physical function while psychologically detaching. It was a survival mechanism, but also a form of death. Some prisoners who survived this way never fully recovered their emotional capacity. Youth provided some advantage. Younger prisoners physically recovered from disease better and adapted to the horrific conditions more readily than older prisoners. But youth also meant less life experience and fewer emotional resources for coping. Finally, survival required luck. Random, arbitrary, meaningless luck. Being in the right place during a selection. Catching a capo in a good mood. Avoiding the typhus that killed the person next to you. Surviving was never just about strategy or strength. It always involved luck, and that luck was a burden for survivors. Why did they survive when millions didn't? What made them special? Nothing, just random chance. That randomness haunted survivors forever. Children in Auschwitz faced immediate death. Most children who arrived were sent directly to gas chambers. They were deemed incapable of labor and therefore had no value to the Nazi system. Mothers who arrived with small children typically went to the gas chambers with them. The SS knew mothers wouldn't leave their children, so they didn't bother separating them. Both died together, usually within hours of arrival. This means most children who died at Auschwitz never experienced camp life. They went from train to gas chamber without ever being registered, tattooed, or admitted to the camp proper. They simply ceased to exist. The children who somehow avoided immediate gassing, typically teenagers who lied about their age or looked mature enough to work, faced impossible conditions. Their bodies couldn't withstand the starvation, disease, and labor. Most died within weeks or months. Some children survived by attaching themselves to adult prisoners who protected them. A prisoner might claim a child as a younger sibling or take them under their protection. The adult would share food rations, help the child appear stronger during selections, teach survival strategies. These relationships sometimes involved exploitation. Adult prisoners might use children for errands, theft, or sexual purposes. The power imbalance meant genuine protection and exploitation often coexisted. But many adults protected children from pure altruism, seeing in them humanity's future or substitutes for their own murdered children. These protectors risked their own survival to help children who reminded them of life before Auschwitz. Dr. Broko. Mengelé's interest in twins gave some children horrific survival opportunities. Twin children were pulled from selection lines for Mengelé's experiments. They received slightly better conditions than other prisoners, but faced painful and often deadly experiments. Mengele measured, photographed, and tested twins extensively. He performed surgeries, injections, and other procedures, trying to understand genetics and heredity. His goal was advancing Nazi racial science. His methods were torture. Some twins survived Mengelé's experiments and were liberated. They carry physical and psychological scars from their experiences. Eva Moses Kor, who survived Mengelé's twin experiments, became a prominent speaker about forgiveness and survival. Family groups that arrived together were immediately separated. Husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from each other. The separation was permanent. Most would never see each other again. Some prisoners discovered family members in the camp by chance, a brother in the same barracks, a cousin in a work detail. These reunions provided enormous psychological comfort, but they also meant witnessing family suffering, which added to the torment. Fathers and sons who remained together sometimes helped each other survive. Elie Wiesel's relationship with his father was central to his survival and later writing. But watching a parent or child suffer was its own form of torture. Some prisoners learned that family members had been in the camp, but died before they could reunite. A prisoner might discover their sister had been in the women's camp, but had died months earlier. This knowledge was devastating. Pregnant women who arrived were sent to gas chambers immediately. Pregnancy was visible evidence of being unable to work. But some women were pregnant without knowing it, or hid early pregnancy. Women who gave birth in the camp faced impossible choices. If the birth was discovered, both mother and infant would be killed. Some prisoner doctors performed secret abortions to save the mother's life. Some women gave birth secretly, with help from other prisoners. In rare cases, babies born in Auschwitz survived hidden by prisoner networks. These cases were extraordinary exceptions, requiring massive risk and cooperation. Almost all infants born in Auschwitz died. The destruction of families was central to the Holocaust's horror. The Nazis didn't just murder individuals, they annihilated entire family lines. Grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren all murdered, erasing families from existence. Survivors who returned after liberation often found themselves completely alone. Every family member dead. No siblings, no parents, no spouse, no children. They were sole survivors of families that had existed for generations. This isolation affected survivors profoundly. They had no one who remembered their childhood, their parents, their siblings. Their entire previous life existed only in their memory, with no one to share those memories. Many survivors remarried and had children after liberation. These new families were built on the ashes of murdered families. Survivor children grew up knowing their parents had lost everything, though many survivors didn't discuss details until decades later. The naming of children after liberation had deep significance. Survivors named children after murdered family members, a son after a father who died at Auschwitz, a daughter after a murdered sister. These names were memorials and attempts to preserve family continuity. But these new families couldn't replace what was lost. The murdered children, parents, and siblings remained absent. The survivors' psychological landscape was populated by ghosts. January 27, 1945. Soviet troops entered Auschwitz. The SS had evacuated most prisoners westward on death marches days earlier. Approximately 7,000 prisoners remained, mostly those too sick to march. The liberators found thousands of corpses, warehouses full of victims' belongings, and survivors who looked like living skeletons. Soviet soldiers, who had witnessed terrible things during the war, were shocked by what they found. Liberation should have meant the end of suffering. It didn't. Many prisoners died in the days and weeks after liberation. Their bodies, pushed beyond endurance, couldn't recover. They died free, but still died. Survivors faced a destroyed world. Most discovered that their families were dead. Their homes were gone. Their communities had been annihilated. They were refugees with nowhere to go. The immediate post-liberation period involved medical care and field hospitals. Survivors needed treatment for starvation, disease, and injuries. But refeeding starving people is medically complex. Some died from refeeding syndrome when their bodies couldn't handle sudden nutrition. Psychological trauma was overwhelming. Survivors experienced what we now recognize as severe PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression. These conditions affected virtually all survivors. In 1945, mental health care was primitive, and trauma treatment didn't exist. Many survivors couldn't speak about their experiences for years or decades. The trauma was too overwhelming. They also faced disbelief when they did speak. People in the outside world couldn't comprehend what had happened. Some thought survivors were exaggerating. Displaced persons camps housed survivors for months or years after liberation. These camps provided shelter, but were themselves difficult. Overcrowded facilities full of traumatized people with no homes to return to. Some survivors emigrated to Palestine, later Israel, the United States, Canada, Australia, or South America. They rebuilt lives in new countries, learning new languages, starting over completely. Others returned to their pre-war homes, hoping to find surviving family members. Many found that neighbors had taken over their property and didn't want to return it. Some returning Jews faced continued anti-Semitism, even violence. In Kielce, Poland, in 1946, a pogrom killed 42 Jews who had survived the Holocaust. Survivors struggled with guilt. Why had they survived when millions didn't? What had they done to survive? Had they compromised morally? These questions tormented them. Many survivors married other survivors. They understood each other's trauma in ways non-survivors couldn't. But these marriages sometimes meant two traumatized people trying to build lives together without adequate emotional resources. Children of survivors, called the second generation, grew up with parents' trauma as a shadow over their childhoods. Many survivors were emotionally distant, overprotective, or struggled with parenting. The trauma transmitted across generations. For decades, survivors often didn't discuss their experiences with their children. They wanted to protect them from the horror. But the silence itself communicated trauma. Children knew something terrible had happened, but didn't know details until they were adults. In the 1960s and 1970s, a cultural shift occurred. The Eichmann trial in 1961 brought Holocaust testimony into public consciousness. Survivors began speaking more openly. Their testimony became part of historical record and public memory. Organizations like the Shoah Foundation collected thousands of video testimonies from survivors. These recordings preserved first-hand accounts before the survivors died. They became invaluable historical and educational resources. Survivors' accounts revealed daily life details that documentation alone couldn't capture. They described the smell of the camp, the hunger, the cold, the fear, the small acts of kindness and cruelty. They made the abstract horror concrete and human. As survivors aged and died, the urgency of preservation increased. By the 2020s, few survivors remained alive. The last generation with direct memory of Auschwitz is passing away. Soon, there will be no living witnesses. This makes documentation and education crucial. The physical site of Auschwitz has been preserved as a museum and memorial. Over 2 million people visit annually. The site serves as evidence of what happened and education about genocide. But the daily life of prisoners, the focus of this documentary, is harder to memorialize. Museum exhibits display artifacts, prisoners' shoes, suitcases, empty Zyklon B canisters. But these objects can't fully convey what daily existence meant. That's why survivor testimony was crucial. Reading Primo Levi's description of hunger, Viktor Frankl's analysis of meaning-making, or Elie Wiesel's account of watching his father die, these first-person accounts communicate the lived reality in ways statistics cannot. The number 1.1 million murdered at Auschwitz is essential historical information. But it's abstract, understanding that each person in that number experienced hunger, fear, pain, and death transforms the statistic into human reality. The survivors who lived to tell their stories carried a burden of testimony. Many felt obligated to speak for those who died. "I survived to bear witness" was a common survivor statement. They felt responsibility to ensure the world knew what happened. But testimony was also re-traumatizing. Describing daily life in Auschwitz meant reliving it. Survivors experienced psychological distress when speaking publicly, yet they continued, believing the importance of testimony outweighed personal cost. The last message of this documentary is perhaps the most important. The daily life of Auschwitz prisoners reveals the Holocaust's true nature, not as abstract historical event, but as the systematic torture and murder of individual human beings. Each person who died in Auschwitz was someone who woke up, felt hunger, experienced cold, feared death, remembered their life before, and faced their end. Understanding daily life in the camp means recognizing the humanity that the Nazis tried to destroy, but never entirely succeeded in destroying. Because even in Auschwitz, in the most systematic attempt to eliminate human dignity ever devised, people maintained their humanity. They shared food scraps, they comforted the dying, they remembered poetry, they made friendships, they hoped. That persistence of humanity in hell itself is the ultimate testament to human resilience. And remembering that humanity, in all its suffering and strength, is how we honor the victims and survivors of Auschwitz.